Hey everybody, we had a really great webinar with Sean the other day, and a lot of questions came in. So we decided that we're going to do just a quick Q&A, add this as well, so you can get really more value out of what Disaster Tech is bringing to the table. Because I'm telling you, this is one of the coolest things that's come around in a long time. I'm so excited about it, and I just can't wait to see it rolled out and what it's doing, and everybody's going to be using this. The old way of doing exercises and training, it's gone now. So this is the future. Sean, well, I don't say welcome back because we're still here, but it's great to see you again.
You too as well, Todd.
Absolutely. So okay, so a bunch of questions came in. I'm going to read the questions out to you, and just yeah, we'll get to them. So one of the questions is how well, or no, so I'm sorry, how well developed your scenarios went when it comes to unique issues facing universities and colleges. Okay, I see what you're saying. So they're asking basically like, how will the scenarios develop outside of just your typical cities and municipalities? Can it be modified specifically for colleges and universities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And during the webinar, I mentioned that we had a number of partnerships with universities. One of them is Indiana University, and specifically through the Luddy School, they have a Crisis Technology Innovation Lab, which is run by Dr. David Wild. He's a professor of data science, but it's not limited to data science. It's where it had its principal beginnings. But we're working with them on a number of products or projects, I should say, on leveraging our tools oriented around the university campus environment. So actively today, Indiana University is using our technology and working with the emergency management office at Indiana University to adapt the technology in order to suit the needs of the university environment. In my prior life as an emergency manager, I worked as an emergency manager at the National Institutes of Health, and the NIH campus is very much like a college campus. We have the largest clinical center in the world, multiple labs, biosafety level 3 labs. In fact, one of them being NIAID, Dr. Fauci's group. Various facilities, a power plant, daycare facilities, housing for certain sick and care patients, lab environments, animal facilities. It's a very, very complex environment. And we would work mutual aid with Montgomery County and the neighboring hospitals, the Naval Hospital across the street, and so forth. So very much local EM, full-time firehouse, full-time police department. On a given day, 40,000 people on campus. Although today, who the heck knows with COVID how many people are actually there on a day-to-day basis who aren't part of the active care of animals and patients. But it's that experience that has been driving, thinking through how we used to conduct training exercises on the campus at NIH and facilitating that between both the academic research, the administrative, and the industrial side of the house, and building out scenarios through that. So much of that experience is driving, our engagement with these universities. And something that I'd be interested in with respect to the International Association of Emergency Managers, I know that there's a college and university caucus that I'd be happy to engage in trying to maybe build out a series of use cases on thinking on how we can better orient not just the gamification piece, but the overall platform for the planning, training, exercises, incident response, EOC management, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great organization to start with for sure, and I bet you we can find some connections there for you. So, how are you working with researchers to work on simulations in supply chain? That's a really great question due to the some of the issues that we're having today.
Yeah, again, great question. We have a strong partnership with the University of Delaware Disaster Research Center. In fact, Dr. Rachel Davidson was a participant on your podcast earlier this year, I believe in September timeframe.
Yes.
And the project that we're working with them is modeling and simulating hurricane effects, particularly in the state of North Carolina, although we're not limited to North Carolina, it's just where we're concentrating the research, is on providing decision support tools on where to evacuate based on the nature and evolution of the risk, right? So as the storm forecasts become more confident, as it's moving its way towards the coast and eventually on land, we're able to showcase where to evacuate based on the total complexity of the risk, which is transportation, the storm surge, the inland flooding, behavioral aspects of how people will or will not evacuate, because we're not assuming it's 100% compliance, right? Folks evacuate or given the order to evacuate and stay in place, shelter in place. And so you need to assume for that, right? So as an emergency manager, you can't be blind to say, well, everyone's going to leave, so I'm going to orient my plans this way. No, we have to assume folks are going to shelter in place and figure out how to resource and support them. One of the next phases in that project is to map out and model impacts to supply chains, whether it be hospitals, critical infrastructure, say the power sector, for example, where you can use the same hazard models and risk models to demonstrate, okay, well, here's the port of entry. This is going to be down. Airports are going to be closed. And then be able to map those second, third, fourth order cascading risks that would have impacts to supply chains, whether that's delivery of goods. An example of this is a while back, but working with the private sector division at FEMA, Walmart and FedEx and some other operators, logistics supply chain companies, were trying to understand, hey, if you can provide us with, here's where these folks are going to evacuate to and displace, we can reroute and redirect supplies, resources to these stores that would be operational where, say, migration would be relocating. So an example would be, I evacuate these 5 counties from the coast. We think based on our modeling, they're going to move to these states or these jurisdictions where there may be shelters where they're going to be received or what have you, where they're a safe distance from the hazard. Can we provide that intelligence so that Walmart can reroute supplies and resources to those locations where you have a new population that just emerged because of the evacuation, right? So there are different ways that we're thinking about this. Another project in with the University of Delaware Disaster Research Center that we're considering doing together is on the effects of earthquakes that cause fires, say related to gas systems, gas disruptions in the LA area, and how we can model the impacts of gas delivery, right, that in its own supply chain to homes. For whatever reason they're using, gas for, whether it's heating, whether it's cooking, and so forth, and understanding the disruptions there. So, the fundamental, the thing about the platform, it's a data science platform. And so we're model agnostic, we're data agnostic. And what we leverage the platform to do is to understand, what is the specific use case? What are the types of problems you're trying to solve? And then convening the right types of stakeholders, whether it's public sector, academia, industry. And again, an example of this with North Carolina, we won a National Science Foundation Civic Innovation Challenge. And the whole concept of that was we had to deliberately link with a civic organization. In this case, it was 2 county emergency managers, Currituck County and New Hanover in North Carolina, and then the state of North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, or the Emergency Management Division. So at the time, Mike Sprayberry, now retired, has moved on into the private sector, but as the director was supportive of our project. And so submitting that support to the National Science Foundation, we were able to win a phase 1 of the project to start building it out. And we're seeking additional funding because ultimately what we'd like to do is be able to scale it beyond North Carolina, at least for the hurricane hazards and threats across the entire Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf Coast states, so that each of those jurisdictions can benefit from it. We've actually presented this at the last National Hurricane Conference in New Orleans over the summer. So if anyone's interested in that presentation, we recorded it, happy to share it around. But I'm also very interested in your input as it relates to, what type of supply chain risks would you like to see model? Of course, I have my own bias because some of the supply chain issues that I've dealt with, whether it be, restoring power in Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the issues that we had with delivering trucks and poles and people and equipment and transformers and all those experiences, it was alarming to me, and it was an eye-opener to me how the loss of power had so many interdependent effects downstream, and things like IV bags, right? So, in the island of Puerto Rico, it's the largest manufacturer of IV bags in the world, and because we didn't prioritize, at least initially, the restoration of that factory, of that critical manufacturing site, the world was struggling
Right.
with IV bag uh, uh, consumption. And we're seeing this today with respect to the vaccine. You look at India, just reported yesterday that even though they have adequate vaccine supply, they've run out of syringes. So even though they have the vaccine available to them, they can't administer the vaccine because they don't have the syringe to do it. Right. So to me, that's a not only interesting but important type of supply chain risk that should be enabled to be modeled to see it's not just the singular commodity, it's all the other uh, aspects that go to it, including the wraparound. Going back to the Puerto Rico example, we're on an island, or the Virgin Islands, all of their infrastructure, housing, let's say for tourism, got destroyed. So all those hotels and inns that would normally be able to house people were no longer available. So we had to get creative in using cruise ships and floating barges to basically create a shelter for all the employees, for all the workers that we brought down to the island to do the work, right? So you can't just think about, oh, well, FEMA ordered 10 million meals and 10 million bottles of water, or whatever the critical commodity is, life-saving commodity. You have to think about all the other supply chain aspects that go into the last mile, the delivery, and the receipt and usage of that resource. So those are things that particularly interest me and interest our company. Those are hard problems to solve.
Mhm.
And if anyone has any ideas or interest on working with us, just let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah, logistics are always an issue across everything that we do. I mean, if you get people over there to work on the problems, you still got to feed them, you got to house them, you got to bathe them, you got to, all the other care associated with that. So that's a good point. So, um, so the question says, I love the analytics of the controllers, but I was hoping for both more connection to the community lifelines and also some of the Esri dashboard products where you can visually drill into communities and get EEI information.
Yeah, it's a great question. Another great question. So initially, when we built the product, we oriented all of our data feeds around the community lifelines. And what we were doing at the time, when we built our first our platform, is we oriented all of the lifelines and the components of the lifelines, right? So energy being one lifeline, and then the two subcomponents of that is oil and gas and power. And then you break that down into its subcompartments, which would be in, say, power, generation, transmission, distribution, right? And each of those aspects have their own different types of data feeds. In fact, it's something that I have raised to the modeling and data working group that's led by FEMA at the national level. There's a group called the SFLAG, which is the Emergency Support Function Leadership Group. It's made up of federal interagency leaders. So that, the head of ESF1 for transportation at DOT, the head of Army Corps of Engineers, ESF3 for public works, and so forth. But there's this subgroup called the Modeling and Data Working Group, or MDWG. And something that we had discussed, of course, this is pre-pandemic, when the world was taken over by that, and FEMA has been consumed with that ever since, in addition to all of the other climate-related hazards that we've been facing. But the concept was to map each uh, each uh, community lifeline to then its components and subcomponents, and then essential elements of information that would map to those. So an obvious one would be on power distribution. Well, what does everyone want to know? That's outages, right? So power outages at the distribution level. Or if it's generation, how many power plants are offline? And if they are online, what's the number of megawatts, the amount of power that's being produced from those generating plants, for example. And then what we were looking to do is then map those essential element information points to critical information requirements that could create tripwires for key decisions. So if you would do a left to right linking between all of that data feed into the system, and then mapping that to your planning requirements, you could do automated, say, recommendations for courses of action. So if a specific data feed comes in, that triggers a critical information requirement that you've identified. So an example would be X amount of customers without power within this jurisdiction. If you reach more than this threshold, then therefore we recommend you do these things, because in our plan it says, if the, for our long-term power outage plan, for example, if the trigger point to start executing on that plan is 100,000 customers without power for more than X amount of time, every jurisdiction has its own tolerance of risk in defining what their planning requirements are and what would trip the plan execution or to recommend execution. We could have the system simply notify somebody, whomever that is, the planning section chief, incident commander, the EOC director, to say, these conditions have been met. We want to let you know that according to your plan, it says that if these conditions are met, we execute on this plan. Do you want to do that? Yes or no? And if you select yes, then we can light up the planning infrastructure, filling out automated incident action plans that are directly aligned to your planning documents, and then feeding in all those critical tasks and objectives and planning assumptions in there, so you can start executing right away. So the idea behind the community lifeline construct in its inception was about stability, right? The stability of the lifeline. And if the lifeline is unstable, then therefore it means we need to intervene in order to upgrade or restore its stability. And so to me, that is more analogous of a continuity of government sort of analogy of mission essential functions, right? You think about the degradation of a MEF. Well, what we haven't done yet as a community, I think, this is just my opinion, is we haven't defined what's that recovery time objective for Lifeline restoration, right? So if I'm going to use Lifelines as a metric of my system is degraded, well, how tolerant am I, right? How long how long can the suck be before we fail? So if it's so if I can't go without power for more than 6 hours, or maybe an easier concrete example would be, a typical planning factor for a hospital, according to Joint Commission, right? So the credentialing body for hospitals, 72 hours, right? So each hospital is required to have generators with 72 hours worth of fuel stored on hand, whether it's ultra low sulfur diesel, propane, whatever the case may be, with the resupply plan to ensure that if they go beyond the 72 hours, they can still maintain their critical functions, their essential functions at the hospital beyond that 72-hour look, right? Because the hospital is expected to be self-sufficient for a limited period of time, but then eventually the straw breaks the camel's back, and now we have to have a contingency of, do we move patients, critical patients, from one mutual aid hospital to another, and so forth. And so, we can start, I think, with some of these planning assumptions or planning factors that we've designed, like 72 hours. If we reach that threshold, we have to start thinking about or executing on moving critical care patients, because folks will die without power, without oxygen, without ventilators, whatever the case may be. So what I'm interested in, and I have been interested in fact, I presented this at the NASA Goddard Center in January of 2020, this exact concept. How can we build data feeds that inform triggering effects, right, of key decisions that need to be made? So it's not to remove the human from the loop. It's not data driven in the sense that the system, the platform, the technology is going to automate every single key action, but rather it's informing the incident organization to say, hey, you guys planned for this. You spent 5 years or 6 years planning for this event. Well, these conditions have been met. And now you have to start thinking about these contingencies, because if we go past 72 hours or 10 days without certain commodities or critical utilities, we need to start taking these actions. And I think that would be a huge game changer, I guess no pun intended, because that's something we can gamify, right? We can play out in an exercise and really test and refine those plans. But until FEMA provides better definition about what does it mean for a lifeline to be degraded, because the red, yellow, green stoplight chart is useful, but it's very subjective,
Mhm.
and it provides no measurable metric on what it means to fail or what it means to succeed or when we feel that it's intolerable to experience this amount of risk, right? Because that's the golden rule of operational risk management, something I learned in the Navy, which was never accept an unnecessary risk,
Right.
right? So why should we be accepting unnecessary risk? But if we're blind to it, we wouldn't know. So it's something that, from the inception of the company, the beginnings of our platform, is how we've built the data models and the ETL functions in the background to be harvesting this data so that we can set it up and prep it to go to the next stage, which is, starting to trigger key decisions based on conditions set by the data that's coming into the platform.
That's a good point. And when I was working in Dana Point, and we're working with a nuclear power plant down the street, we'd have to do yearly exercises, and every other year is a graded exercise. And it kind of just brings into the idea of going to failure, right? And we go to the point to where, when during the exercise, when we had the release came in, you're buying into the training, you're buying into the process. And it was really kind of, the whole room got quiet because we really understood what that was, what that meant. And I think it's important for us to practice to play in gamification to failure, so we know what that's like. Because if you don't, so like a boxer said, if you've never been punched before, the first time you get punched, it's going to be a rude awakening, right? And you don't want it to be during game day when you first get punched in the eye.
Exactly, and to build off of that point very quickly, it goes back to it's not the plan, it's the planning, right? And without the validation, the exercise of the testing, the constant rigor and iteration on the plan, and through the planning process, many of those assumptions. And another saying I think is no plan survives first contact,
Yeah.
right? So we know the plan is going to fail in some way because we don't have a crystal ball into the future. But if we can use games and exercise to constantly be iterating on that and not having to wait for a 24 to 18-month planning cycle, exercise planning cycle, to get to that point of starting to validate, being able to do it faster, more rapid, every day during blue skies, constantly learning, constantly updating, and gaining better assumptions, challenging assumptions on a much more routine cadence, is only going to make the whole system better, and of course reducing risk and saving lives in the process.
Absolutely. So this is going to be an interesting question. One would think there's a capability like a Sim City to simulate overhead view of a city, for example, to show minute by minute actions and impacts of a threat, with the AI beginning the what ifs, and as well as the injects of players' actions such as staging resources, operational missions. We need this for lots of scenarios. And one of the areas that Esri is missing is plume analysis based on weather.
Yeah, so I'll break that down into two parts. One is the sim city simulation piece, and the other is the plume modeling. So first, in the plume modeling, I think I mentioned during the webinar, there's a group called the Interagency Modeling Atmospheric Assessment Center, IMAC, that FEMA leads, and they don't produce the models. They're just a coordinating function, right? That's traditional emergency management, to coordinate disparate parts to solve whatever the problem is. And so what they do is they farm out the requests for the plume. So in the case of, you mentioned a fixed nuclear facility, power plant, there's a fuel element failure, aka meltdown, and there's a release of uh, of of radiation because the containment failed, right? So, because if the containment stays, it's going to be bad inside of it. But as long as the containment doesn't break, then everyone inside the building might die, but at least the community outside won't. But
Right.
eventually, it gets so hot that and the reaction continues to go if you're not putting water on it. Anyways, not to get down the nuclear rabbit hole, because I came from the nuclear navy, but the point is there are labs out there that have the responsibility and the scientific knowledge to run those models. And part of the reason why the national labs have the knowledge, because they used to be nuclear weapons labs, and when we were blowing weapons up all over the place, they have the best data on how this stuff spreads, right? but it's complex because in a desert, when you blow up a bomb, there's no buildings, right? There's no obstructions. Whereas in a metropolitan area, depending on where the plant has been located, as the plume moves, it's going to hit buildings. There's wind, there's other diversions, and that gets complex and complicated. So FEMA then sends it out to the lab, and then the lab returns the model, and then IMAC distributes that to whomever the consumer is, the state, the power plant operator, whomever's requesting the asset, right? Now, this reminds me of an example that I talk about all the time, which is when I was at Department of Energy, which many of the labs fall under, so 17 national labs, Livermore, Berkeley, Oak Ridge, Argonne, et cetera. They all have different expertise and reasons to be, and so you work with them in a coordinated fashion to figure out, okay, I'll go to Argonne for this, and I'll go to Pacific Northwest Lab for that, and I'll go to Brookhaven for this, and so forth. And so Argonne National Lab, they have a predictive outage model. It's a wind field model for hurricanes, and we use this in the actual real world, where we can show, based on the current forecast track from NOAA, here's what the power outage prediction is going to look like. 60% of this county is going to be without power because of this analysis. Okay, well, that's good. Well, if I know that 100% of power is going to be out in this particular community, and there's 3 hospitals there, that gives me the insight to say, hey, your hospital is going to be without power. You can alert them and let them know that it's likely forecasted you're not going to have power. So maybe, onboard more fuel or take certain decisions to be more resilient in case this scenario happens. But the problem was, well, it's not a problem. It's more of a gap, is that they would provide that analysis to me in a PDF or in a PowerPoint. I couldn't take the data from the outage model or the plume model and then put that in to another platform, let's say an Esri or some other mapping system, and then start to do that basic correlation analysis of what is my risk exposure from, whether it's power outage or it's a radiological or biological plume or chemical plume. I want to know what's the exposure to the community, because that's what I'm going to respond to, right? The casualties, the people that I need to evacuate, communicate to, hey, it's coming your way. You need to go to higher floor because certain chemicals are heavier than air, and go to the basement, and that's how people die, and so forth. So they need to be able to communicate to the public, hey, you're at risk, right? And so that the community makes a decision whether to stay or go, whatever the case may be. So what we need to do as a community, emergency management in general, right, is start to broker those relationships with the modeling companies that build out the plume models, and be very frank and direct to say, hey, a PDF is interesting, a PowerPoint is interesting, that's helpful and useful, but would be more useful is if I can get access to the data that informs that model, so that I can run secondary analysis off of it, like how many people are exposed to this chemical or this, radiological release of, xenon or gamma or whatever, and being able to do that, or to show in this blast radius of an explosion, these facilities have been impacted, and it's likely. And we used to do this with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency all the time, military installations. A vehicle-borne IED, we would drive up the vehicle, not literally, but in the simulation, and blow the thing up, and then show the blast radius and how all the windows and stuff are going to be blown in, and the pressure behind it. And if folks are working at their desks, it's likely going to be that there's X number of people dead, and so therefore, in my plan, I have to assume I need, X number of helicopters to do medical evac. I need Y number of, fire EMS assets to do so forth and so on. If it is chemically related, I have to have the staging equipment and all of the decontamination, the MOP suits, hazmat suits, whatever, to be able to work through that incident type. And obviously, if we don't have the resource here locally, if our firehouse doesn't have a full-time hazmat unit, I need to broker that mutual aid agreement or enter into agreement with the neighboring firehouse or wherever, so I can get that if this, so happens.
Right.
So I think what is necessary to move to the next thing is, and I say this all the time, this is not a technology problem, it's a governance problem, right? Where there's an asset or a company who has the ability to run the models. We just need access, and we need to be able to connect and interconnect systems so that we can communicate the risk, do that secondary analysis, whether it's to the built-in environment, physical infrastructure, or humans, and then be able to use that as a tool both to plan in blue skies, like your LEPC does, right? Your local emergency planning committee, that's required by statute. If you have certain types of chemicals in your backyard, you got to plan for it, right? And what would be so much better for an LEPC to have is those types of models and data and analysis to do those secondary planning, so they can reach out to the community, which is their also the requirement of the law, right? The outreach to the community to say, hey, this is in your backyard. This is what we're doing about it. Here are the resources that we have. And this is what you need to know and you need to do in the event of this release. So the second part of the question was, remind me again, Todd.
Yeah, it was the SimCity portion of it.
SimCity thing, yeah. So one of the partnerships that we have is with the NVIDIA Corporation, and the CEO of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang. If you're not familiar with NVIDIA, they build the GPU, the graphics processing unit. So if you have an Xbox or a PlayStation or a computer, most computers have an NVIDIA graphics card in it, right? So major motion picture movies, Star Wars, Scooby-Doo movie, Finding Nemo, whatever, use GPUs to render the graphics, right? Well, the other net benefit of GPUs not only is the graphics, but it's the data, because of the memory footprint. Without geeking out too much, just think of it from a physics problem. If I have a bigger pipe versus a smaller pipe, well, if I have a big pipe, I can put more water through the big pipe than I can the smaller pipe. So the GPU affords that opportunity to put more memory through the system. And so because of this, we recognize that in a disaster in particular, a classical example, or an anecdotal example, I should say, of this was about 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, there was an earthquake in Southern California. And the earthquake was modest. It was like a 5 point something, maybe a 6.0. I think it initially was like a 6.3, and then it was downgraded to 5.8 or something. Regardless, a bunch of people decided they were going to go to the USGS website to see the shake map. Well, when they did that, this huge inbound of traffic came to the website, and it crashed, right? And so it shut down the server. So our system was trying to pull in the shake map data from the USGS, and we were getting a fail from that pull because the server went down. And so what that basically means is that the system wasn't set up to scale with that type of increase of volume and velocity of inputs, right? Because the user, the IP address, is just another data input, and so it crashed the system. Well, the same is true data ingest, in the event of a disaster, because all of a sudden you're consuming more data than you were in blue skies, right? Because the operation, the number of people inside the incident has to scale as well. Well, the cool thing that NVIDIA has done is they've created the Omniverse, and now everyone has the verse, the metaverse with Facebook, and the Dataverse with Microsoft, and I'm sure there's other verses out there, whatever. But the Omniverse that NVIDIA has been piloting in a proof of concept is this idea of being able to show the Earth, the complete globe, the round Earth that it is, not the flat Earth, but the round Earth, right? And to see, and they did, the initial demonstration was actually a hurricane. So you can see the hurricane, in 3D, in the globe, and be able to look, above, below the hurricane in the atmosphere, and showing the rain. And it was really cool, right? So what if you could do the same and showing in a time series over time, okay, here the hurricane comes, we're predicting the outages, you're seeing the community go black, right? Start, the lights go out, and also to see the physical damage occur to that physical infrastructure, right? So basically what you're talking about is Sim City. And we have aspirations with Microsoft and gamification to do this exact thing, to create a digital twin of your world, whatever your jurisdiction or community is, to be able to model and simulate in real time the effects of whatever hazard, calamity that may happen, as a result of that. So the cool thing about it is the technology is already there. I mean, honestly, it really now it's just going to take investment and resources to build out the environment to ensure that it actually is a mirror image or as much of a digital twin of the real world as possible. Because the risk too, as much as I'm excited about it, we don't want to create negative learning of giving people a false sense of reality either.
Right, right.
The models aren't fully attenuated to the simulated world. So maybe we don't try and bite off the whole apple at one time. Maybe we can simulate, the effects of a hurricane to one infrastructure system and show how that fails. And then in the non-metaverse, we can make those, derivative analysis on how the outage scenario creates cascading effect to hospitals and other systems where, it might just be creating a Cadillac for no reason. There's no sense in over investing in a technology when humans in the flesh can do it much easier, much more cost effective, where the return on investment really isn't there. So I think it's going to be a balance of where does the Sim City world or the metaverse world have a net benefit where we want to make that type of investment because it's not cheap, it's
Right.
expensive. Where do we make the right investments there versus where not? And I think, a basic example of this would be point of care, thinking like CPR, right? That's much more understood. It's much more controlled. So if I'm in a simulated world and someone falls over and has a heart attack and I go and start doing compressions, to me that seems like a virtual or augmented reality thing that is low investment, low cost, would probably provide a lot of realism and tangible understanding of the environment than it would this whole mega city complex, how things fail and interoperate. It's hard enough to model that in on paper. It's incredibly difficult to model that in a three-dimensional virtual reality world.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my opinion on the like the SimCity type thing. I've goofed around with it a little bit. There was I forget the name of the organization. There's a place where you can go and do virtual meetings and things like this. And there's a gamification to it where you walk your avatar around and go into places. It's kind of neat, but there's also like little glitchy things with it, and that was part of the fun that I had with it. Was like there's like a motorboat that you can get into and like trying to glitch that out and stuff like this. But I get that and how we can see things moving forward. But I like the idea of being in a room with people, and using real data that's coming in, kind of what you're doing, exactly what you're doing with Voltron, and then and the ability to make decisions and even if it's virtually in the sense of a virtual EOC like we're doing here with this meeting, or if it's in a room with a bunch of people where you have face-to-face conversations with your colleagues to make decisions. I think that's critical, and I think that's a little bit more real world than it is to play in the virtual space. But that's just my opinion. And
Well, I think uh, I agree with you. I'm like you. I want to be in person, meeting with people, talking with people. Spent my whole career in meetings, in offices and EOCs, physically in person with people doing things. And then the pandemic changed everything. But there are people that like the virtual world, right? So this is why I'm promoting the hybrid concept, which is let's build the user experience that meets everyone's inclusive needs, and also extending the bench, right? If somebody lives out in the suburbs and driving 3-4 hours to work just adds fatigue and stress and overhead, and maybe those folks want to do it, but it might be that we have, and I'm just using arbitrary numbers, 60% of the workforce in person in the EOC, where 40% of the workforce can be virtual and remote. And we can use these sort of hybrid tools where we can create the virtual space where folks are walking around and things like that to net benefit the people in the virtual world while maintaining the integrity of the physical space
mm,
in person. And I think I think to simplify it, right, the extroverts and the introverts, if there's a way that we can sort of create a world and in an environment that is inclusive to, how people want to engage with the world, and I think that's okay. And if it makes them more effective as a professional and makes them more effective as part of the team, ultimately, all I want to do is solve the problem, right?
Right,
Stop
right,
the
right.
bleed, resuscitate the breathing, get to rehabilitation, restore the system, whatever the objective is. So I think that's the key takeaway in all this. And again, from my personal perspective, not even speaking on behalf of the company necessarily, but is what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? What's our intent? And let's build infrastructure, technologies, support systems around the intent of what we're trying to achieve, not the other way around. Because otherwise, we're getting the tail wagging the dog. We allow
Right.
the systems to start driving process, and that's not good, right? Because that's just adding overhead and inertia, and making it harder to solve the problem than it is easier. So, technology is a great thing until it isn't.
Right. Right.
And the lights go out, and then all of a sudden you can't use it. So, you know, when you run an exercise and you have a digital measle, it's always still good to have a paper copy. Even the exercise that we did in Florida, Southern Florida, pre-hurricane season, we shut off the power to the EOC. That was one of the injects. And so we forced the EOC team, all the ESFs, the incident commander, the wing, to do the whiteboarding. And then once they were off the whiteboarding, they re-put that system stuff back into the system for the full digital record. But it's really important to have the backups to the backups to the backups. Anything I learned in nuclear Navy, it's resiliency starts with redundancy.
Right.
Having the backups to the backups. If the intent is to get back to the surface and everyone lives another day, then you better make sure that the backups work, and the the success of survival is higher than not.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I had my EOC, I called it the EOC in the box, and it was an Econics box away from the building that we were in.
Yep.
So if we need to get down to it, open it up, and everybody had a tote with the plan on paper, with pencils, literally not even pens because they dry out, right? With pencils and pads and stuff like this to go into another location if we need to. So absolutely, having the backup to the backup, the redundancy is resiliency, and I love that quote. I'm going to use that from now on. Thank you, Sean, for that. Well, we're coming here to the end of this. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Questions that weren't asked that are here, or things you've heard in the past that I think that's important to get out to people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I think again, this is not a technology problem; it's a problem of governance. But we're leveraging technology to streamline governance, to make governance better, right? To make your ability to serve better. That's why we exist. We're a public benefit company. And we have a series of design principles. One of them is science and data at the foundation of everything we do. Another is increased risk literacy. Another is prepare for the unknown, and so forth. But the first design principle is to co-design with the user, with the emergency manager. And that's critically important. So, what I would like as an action, hopefully, for those who are watching, is to reach out, to talk with us, to sit down with us, to inform our design decisions. Because ultimately, if we're not designing this for the emergency manager, we're failing. And we've done an incredible amount of research to date. In fact, the last two IAM conferences, we did studies and outreach. So the virtual one that was in 2020, and then of course the past one in person, 2021, is getting that feedback right from the community. What do you want? What don't you like? What tools you're using? What can improve? What can be better? Without that type of insight, without that type of feedback, we're never going to get you the platform or types of capabilities that you need. So the question about plume modeling, that's fantastic. The question about critical information or essential information, essential elements of information, EIs, and the community lifelines, understanding that you all want to orient around this, right? So it's where we started. We made a pivot. We went away from the community lifelines, but if you're telling us that we need to come back to it, we will. So that's so important. And on the gamification piece, we're just getting started. I mean, this is total tip of the iceberg. And we have the full support and partnership with Microsoft to totally just nail this because, from our view collectively, with respect to climate change, we need to start modeling and simulating this in all the scenarios at a hyper local level, at a regional level, at a national level, at an international level, right? And we need a platform that is able to scale so that we can see over the horizon and conceptualize the risk so that we can make the right investments to be resilient and to reduce risk in our communities from future climate disasters. So again, please reach out. Really easy to get to me. It's either Sean@DisasterTech.com or community@DisasterTech.com. That's more of a catch-all. You'll get multiple folks of us on the team. But please reach out, connect, because eventually what we're aiming to do is to create a user community, similar to what Esri does, in fact, when they have their user conference, where we bring everybody around the table and solve problems. And I like that concept, and I'm eventually bringing it into DisasterTech, but I'd love to create a user community with a series of user conferences and workshops and training and so forth, where we can really leverage the platform to be a canvas for the emergency manager to plan, to train, to exercise, to be able to communicate to whomever their constituents are, the public, elected leaders, partners in industry, and so forth, to solve the hard problems that we're facing, unfortunately, ahead. So as we come out of the pandemic, let's take this silver lining and the future of work has accelerated and figure out how to get to that hybrid approach where some of us are still going to be in virtual land for majority of the time or permanently, and some of us are going to be in brick and mortar, and we have to marry those two environments. But again, I'm not going to do it. We're not going to do it without your input and feedback on how to build this thing successfully. So that's my final parting thoughts, and thank you so much, Todd, as always, for having us and me on the program, and very bright future ahead.